Have you ever felt the slow, creeping weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on your chest like an unseen hand? The kind that doesn't grip you all at once but tightens its fingers one knuckle at a time. So subtly you don't even notice until you can't breathe. You were taught to be kind, to be accommodating, to smooth the edges of your personality so no one would ever feel the discomfort of your sharpness. You learned to smile when you wanted to scream, to nod when you wanted to resist, to fold yourself into smaller and smaller shapes just to fit the spaces others carved out for you. And now, years later, you wonder, when did goodness become a cage? This is the dark side of control in relationships, not the kind that announces itself with violence or demands, but the quiet, insidious force that shapes you without your consent. It's the lover who never raises their voice but always gets their way, the friend whose disappointment is a weapon, the family member whose love is conditional upon your obedience. It's the way you've been trained to mistake control for care, domination for devotion. And no one understood this better than Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher who saw through the illusions of human connection and exposed the brutal mechanics of power hidden beneath the surface of love. Schopenhauer, often dismissed as a pessimist, was in truth a relentless observer of human nature. He saw relationships not as sacred bonds of mutual affection but as battlegrounds of will, where one person's desire for dominance collides with another's need for survival. His philosophy strips away the comforting lies we tell ourselves, that love is selfless, that kindness is always pure, that control is something only monsters wield. Instead, he reveals how control wears many masks, sometimes as soft as a plea, as gentle as a suggestion, as innocent as a "I just want what's best for you." Think of the last time you changed yourself for someone else, not because you wanted to, but because it was easier than enduring their silence, their sighs, their carefully curated disappointment. That is control in its most refined form. The kind that doesn't need to shout because it has trained you to flinch at the mere possibility of displeasure. It's the reason you second-guess your instincts, why you feel guilty for setting boundaries, why the word selfish echoes in your skull whenever you dare to want something for yourself. This is the prison of enforced goodness. The bars are invisible, the locks are psychological, and the guards are the voices, both external and internal, that hiss you should be better, you should be easier, you should be less. Schopenhauer's genius was in recognizing that this dynamic isn't an aberration. It's the default setting of human interaction. We are all, in some way, both the jailer and the jailed, trapped in cycles of manipulation and submission, even and especially when we call it love. But here's the truth they don't want you to see. Awareness is the first act of rebellion. To recognize the mechanisms of control is to begin dismantling them. This isn't about cynicism. It's about clarity. It's about seeing the strings so you can decide whether to dance or cut yourself free. Schopenhauer's philosophy cuts through the romanticized veneer of human relationships like a scalpel, exposing the raw nerves of power beneath. At the heart of his observations lies a brutal truth. What we often call love or connection is, in many cases, a sophisticated negotiation of wills, one where control is not the exception but the rule. He saw human interaction as a constant, often unconscious, struggle for dominance, where the subtlest gestures, a pause, a glance, a strategically withheld approval, can exert more force than an outright command. This is the essence of what he termed the will to live, an insatiable drive that manifests not just in survival but in the need to shape the world and people around us to our desires. Consider the way influence operates in relationships. It rarely announces itself. Instead, it seeps in through the cracks of vulnerability, disguised as concern, as guidance, as protection. A partner who insists on choosing your friends for your own good, a parent whose love is doled out in portions based on obedience, a friend who frames their demands as moral superiority. All of these are variations of the same dynamic. One person's will imposing itself upon another's autonomy. Schopenhauer recognized that this is not necessarily malicious. Often, it is unconscious. The controller may believe they are acting from love, just as the controlled may believe they are acting from devotion. But intention does not negate effect. The result is the same. A slow erosion of the self, a surrender so gradual it feels like choice. One of Schopenhauer's most piercing insights is the concept of indirect control. The way people manipulate through absence rather than presence. Silence can be a weapon. Withdrawal of affection can be a punishment. The unspoken threat of abandonment, disapproval, or even just cold indifference can condition a person more effectively than any direct command. This is why so many find themselves trapped in relationships where nothing is overtly demanded, yet everything is expected. The rules are unwritten, the boundaries shifting, the consequences implied rather than stated. It is a form of psychological governance where the ruler never has to raise their voice because the subjects have already internalized the law. But why do we comply? Why do so many people surrender their autonomy, sometimes without even realizing it? Schopenhauer points to two fundamental human fears: the terror of isolation and the dread of conflict. We are social creatures, wired to seek belonging, and for many, the price of admission is submission. To resist is to risk exile, not just from a person, but from the identity we've built within that relationship. This is why leaving a controlling dynamic can feel like stepping off a cliff. It's not just the other person we lose, but the version of ourselves that was shaped to fit them. Yet there is another layer to this, one Schopenhauer explores with chilling precision: the illusion of free will within control. Many people in such relationships will insist they are acting of their own volition. I choose to make them happy. I want to avoid drama. It's easier this way. And in a technical sense, they're right. They are making choices. But what happens when every choice is made under the invisible weight of another's expectations? When the alternatives are so fraught with tension that compliance feels like the only viable path? This is the paradox of psychological control. It convinces you that you are free even as it narrows your world to a single, acceptable lane. Schopenhauer's remedy for this dynamic is not rebellion for its own sake, but awareness, the deliberate, often painful act of seeing the mechanisms at play. To recognize control is to destabilize it, because the most potent forms of domination rely on the unexamined mind, the unchallenged assumption that this is just how things are. Once you see the strings, you can no longer pretend you're dancing freely. There is an old tale from the East about a bird born in a cage. It never knew the sky, only the bars. And when the door was left open one day, it did not fly away. It paced the familiar floor, its wings folded, its eyes downcast, because freedom was a language it had never learned to speak. This is the tragedy of the conditioned self, the way control, when endured long enough, becomes not just a force acting upon us but a structure within us. Schopenhauer understood this intimately, and his philosophy is threaded with metaphors that reveal the deeper, often unconscious, narratives of domination and submission. Consider the myth of the puppet and the puppeteer. On the surface, it seems simple. One pulls the strings, the other dances. But what happens when the puppeteer whispers to the puppet that the strings are its own veins, that their tension is the natural order of things? The puppet begins to believe it moves of its own will, never realizing that every gesture, every step, is dictated by an unseen hand. This is the insidious brilliance of psychological control. It convinces you that compliance is autonomy, that surrender is choice. Schopenhauer saw this dynamic everywhere, from romantic relationships to familial bonds. Even in the way society molds individuals into acceptable shapes, the strings are not always visible, but their pull is felt in the quiet exhaustion of people who spend their lives performing for an audience they can never quite please. Then there is the allegory of the garden, where one person appoints themselves the gardener and the other the plant. The gardener insists they only prune and water out of love, that their shears are tools of care, not cruelty. But the plant, once wild and sprawling, learns to grow in predetermined directions, its branches trimmed into palatability. Over time, it forgets what untamed growth felt like. It begins to fear the very sunlight that once nourished it, because the gardener has taught it to crave the shade of control. Schopenhauer would argue that this is the essence of many relationships, the slow, systematic pruning of a person's spirit under the guise of nurture. The tragedy is not just in the cutting, but in the plant's eventual belief that it could not survive without the shears. But perhaps the most haunting narrative is that of the mirror. In some relationships, one person becomes the mirror, the surface that reflects back not what is, but what the other desires to see. The mirror is not allowed to have its own image. Its purpose is to affirm, to validate, to erase any distortion that might cause discomfort. And when the mirror dares to show something unflattering, it is not the reflection that is questioned, but the mirror itself. You're being cruel. You're overreacting. You're not yourself today. Schopenhauer recognized this as a form of existential control. The denial of a person's right to their own reality. The mirror, over time, loses the ability to recognize itself. It only knows how to reflect. These symbolic narratives are not just stories. They are blueprints of the invisible architectures that shape our lives. They reveal how control operates not through brute force, but through myth-making, the stories we are told and tell ourselves about love, duty, and identity. Schopenhauer's genius was in exposing these myths for what they are: systems of power dressed in the robes of necessity. To see them is to begin the work of dismantling them. The realization that you have been shaped by unseen forces is both terrifying and exhilarating. Like waking from a dream only to discover the walls of your room were never really there. Schopenhauer's insights into the dark side of control are not meant to paralyze us with their bleakness, but to arm us with the most potent weapon we possess: awareness. Once you see the mechanisms of manipulation, you can no longer unsee them. And that is where true agency begins. But how do we translate this awareness into action? How do we dismantle the invisible cages without tearing apart the relationships that, despite their flaws, we may still cherish? The answer lies not in rebellion for its own sake, but in the slow, deliberate work of reclaiming sovereignty over your own mind. Consider the practice of boundary setting, often touted as the antidote to control, yet so difficult to enact without guilt. The problem is that boundaries are not just lines we draw for others. They are mirrors that reflect back to us our own worth. When you say, "This is where I end and you begin," you are not just speaking to the other person. You are reminding yourself that your existence does not require justification. Schopenhauer would argue that the resistance we feel to setting boundaries is not a personal failing, but the inevitable friction of a will pushing against another's will. The key is to recognize that discomfort is not a sign you're doing it wrong, but proof you're doing something real. Start small, a delayed response to a demand that once would have sent you scrambling. A gentle but firm "I see it differently," a refusal to absorb blame for another's dissatisfaction. These are the first tremors of an earthquake that will eventually reshape the landscape of your relationships. Then there is the art of discernment, learning to distinguish between genuine care and covert control. The difference often lies not in what is said, but in what happens when you resist. Love that respects autonomy will recalibrate. Control will retaliate, sometimes subtly, withdrawal, passive aggression, and sometimes overtly, guilt-tripping, gaslighting. Schopenhauer's philosophy teaches us to watch for the recoil of the will when it is denied its object. This is not about demonizing those who seek to influence us. We are all guilty of it in some measure, but about recognizing when influence crosses into domination. Ask yourself, does this person's love expand me or diminish me? Do I feel more or less alive in their presence? The body knows long before the mind admits it. Trust the tension in your shoulders, the weight in your chest, the quiet dread that lingers after an interaction. Perhaps the most radical act of integration is the reclamation of your own narrative. Control thrives in the shadows of unspoken stories. The myths that you are too much or not enough, that your needs are burdensome, that your no is a betrayal. Rewrite them. Begin by interrogating the assumptions you've inherited. Who told me that my worth is earned through compliance? When did I learn that love requires surrender? Schopenhauer understood that our inner dialogues are often echoes of external voices. And to change the conversation, we must first become aware of the script. Keep a journal of moments when you feel yourself shrinking or apologizing for existing. Trace them back to their roots. Over time, you will begin to spot the patterns, and in that spotting, you will find the power to choose differently. In the real world, this work has ripple effects far beyond the personal. Every time someone refuses to perform their assigned role in the theater of control, they disrupt the system for others. A woman who stops apologizing for her voice gives permission for another to speak. A man who rejects toxic stoicism makes space for others to feel. Schopenhauer's bleak worldview paradoxically contains this seed of hope. Once we see the machinery of domination, we can opt out of its gears. The transformation is not instantaneous. It is the slow unfurling of a self that has spent lifetimes folded into unnatural shapes. But with each act of defiance, however small, the prison walls grow thinner, until one day you realize you were never locked in at all. You were just waiting for your own permission to leave. We began with the image of invisible chains, the weight of expectations masquerading as love. Now we arrive at the threshold of a question. What happens when you decide to lay down the mask of goodness? When you stop mistaking control for care? Schopenhauer's answer is both brutal and liberating. You will lose some people. The relationships built on the old dynamics may not survive the shift. But in that loss, you will find something far more precious: the unshakable certainty of your own existence. This is the transformational heart of his philosophy. Not pessimism, but a clarion call to wakefulness. The dark side of control in relationships is not an aberration. It is the inevitable result of wills colliding in a world that confuses possession for love. But you are not doomed to repeat its patterns. Every moment of awareness, every small act of resistance, is a stone dropped into the still waters of your life, sending out ripples that will eventually reach shores you cannot yet see. The journey is not about becoming someone new, but about unearthing the self that was there all along. The one that knew, even in the quietest hours, that love should not feel like surrender. So here is the call, simple and unyielding. Stop asking for permission to exist. The world will try to convince you otherwise, will whisper that you are too much or not enough, that your boundaries are cruel, your needs unreasonable. Do not believe it. The tragedy of control is not that it happens, but that we consent to it, mistaking our chains for safety. Schopenhauer's gift to us is the realization that the prison door was never locked. It was only ever waiting for you to push it open.